Today we're going to talk about proximity as it relates to attachment dynamics. So most sessions that you begin with clients begin before anyone ever says a word. And what do I mean by this? I mean that when a client walks into your office, let's just assume you're working in person, they're going to choose where to sit, right? When they're doing that choosing, usually their body's choosing for them, and they're going to select a distance or an orientation in the room that signifies a specific relationship to you, the practitioner's body in space and in time. And in that selection, if you know how to read it, the session that you're about to do has already begun, and it's going to show you something. I've watched this happen over and over again. For over a decade now, I've been working with people and tracking this movement that happens. And what I notice is these patterns, right? So watching people organize themselves in relation to another body tells us something. And watching what shifts when someone moves closer or when I move closer, and watching what maybe their breathing does and what their breath or their chest or what their eyes do, it tells me something. And what I've begun to understand is that most of our training as practitioners has prepared us to listen with words. So we're listening while the client's body is having a totally different conversation with us. And it's a conversation that's a bit more honest, maybe even older, and far more relevant than any other thing that the client could say out loud. And this is the territory of proximity. It's where attachment expresses itself as a living negotiation between bodies. So really think about that. It's a place where the patterns that we've been taught to identify are more obvious. So a little history. In 1966, an anthropologist named Edward Hall published a book called The Hidden Dimensions. So in this book, he described something that everyone already knew about, but hadn't really bothered to formalize in any way. So he formalized this. And it's this: human beings maintain predictable distances from one another, and these distances carry meaning. And he called the study of this proxemics. And he mapped out 4 concentric zones. So the 4 zones are intimate distance, and that's where touch is possible and breath can be felt, that real intimate distance. Then there's personal distance, and this is reserved for close friends and family. Social distance for acquaintances, and public distance, and this is the distance for strangers and for formally addressing people. Hall was interested in culture, and so as an anthropologist, this makes sense. He noticed that what feels like an appropriate conversational distance in Buenos Aires, for instance, creates claustrophobia in Helsinki, for instance. And that invisible bubble around a Japanese businessman and a Texan rancher are calibrated totally differently. Completely different specifications based on culture. So his insight was that space is a language. Really think about this. A language that's so fundamental that we rarely notice that we're speaking this language. Right? Hall didn't explore what the somatic field has been slowly articulating for the past 40 years, and that's that these distances are also something that form in the developmental process. They're formed in the first years of life and the body's earliest negotiations with proximity, with caregivers. And additionally, they carry forward as somatic structures. So something we can begin to identify and notice. It'll show up as patterns of tissue organization, muscular bracing, respiratory restriction, postural orientation. And these are things that were shaped by the particular quality of closeness or distance that a person received or didn't receive when they were young. And this is during the period of brain development when they were too young to have any say in the matter or make up any story about it. It was just some implicit memory. So take a minute and think about what closeness actually requires of the body. And we're going to explore this a little bit. To allow another person into your intimate zone, the nervous system, and really your entire body, has to perform an extraordinary act of trust. Right? And what am I talking about with trust? It's the muscles around the chest have to soften enough to allow full respiration inside someone else's presence. The eyes have to be able to sustain contact without the startle reflex hijacking your visual system, right? Without your eyes blinking a lot or there being a stuckness. The gut has to settle and the jaw relaxes. Right? So the entire muscular envelope of the body has to shift from a posture of vigilance to one of reception, and that, from bracing to receiving. We have to let in and be moved by another, be felt by another, and to feel them. Right? So there's precision in this in the physiological sense, and Dr. Porges' polyvagal theory gives us the mechanism of this. I know there's a lot going on in the world about polyvagal theory right now, and we're just holding it loosely here. Yeah. So we just say the analogy of this teaches us something. The ventral vagal system, when functioning well, inhibits defensive responses and supports what Porges calls social engagement system. Yeah. So the coordinated recruitment of facial muscles, middle ear muscles, laryngeal and pharyngeal muscles, and the heart, and all of the parts of the body that are involved in proximity, right, in service to safety. When the system is online, right, your body feels like closeness is possible. And when it goes offline, when neuroception detects threat, the body will reorganize, and the muscles stiffen or collapse, and the breath becomes shallow or held, and the eyes either fix or avert. Yeah. And the distance that the person maintains from others becomes this sort of somatic solution to a problem that the conscious mind might not even be registering. And so I'm sharing this because this might be something that you're missing when you're working with your clients, right? The client who always sits in the chair furthest from you, or the client whose torso rotates slightly away while their head faces you, right? A split between social compliance and something else, some sort of somatic truth, right? Then there's the client who leans in way too quickly and too eagerly, collapsing the distance in a way that might erase the sense of boundary before you've established the safety for that to happen. And, these are things to really consider as material to work with, right? The words will come later, but the body is already telling you everything that you need to know about its history. So Pat Ogden, in her work on sensory motor psychotherapy, has described what she calls proximity-seeking actions. This is reaching out, making eye contact, leaning toward, holding on, pulling closer, and their counterparts pushing away, turning the head, crossing the arms, pulling back, breaking eye contact. Yeah, these are fundamental movements of attachment and the behavioral building blocks of what Bowlby described theoretically, and that Ogden grounded in the body. I'm really grateful for what Pat Ogden has contributed to this field. So what her framework reveals about attachment is that it's a movement, right? There's some sort of procedural involvement here, continuous moment-to-moment oscillation between approach and withdrawal, between the impulse toward connection and the impulse toward self-protection. So in a securely attached system, this oscillation is fluid. And really in any healthy body, it's fluid. So the body moves towards contact, registers the quality of that contact, adjusts, moves away when it needs to, returns when it's ready, and the rhythm is there's a sense of aliveness in this rhythm, right? There's improvisation to it, like dancing or music. In an insecure system, though, the oscillation gets stuck, right? So the avoidantly organized body learns to truncate the approach, right? So reaching impulse begins and then cancels itself out. And sometimes so quickly, it's invisible to the untrained eye. And what you see instead is the aftermath, a body that holds itself together at the periphery, shoulders drawn slightly inward, muscular self-sufficiency that looks like composure, but usually somatically a form of bracing against the vulnerability that proximity might require. Now, Allan Schore has written extensively about how this pattern is encoded in the right hemisphere during the first 2 years of life, when the infant's brain is being literally sculpted by the quality of right brain to right brain communication with the primary caregiver. And Dr. Bruce Perry wrote a lot about this too in his work. Right, so the mother's face, her voice, her rhythm of approach and withdrawal, the felt quality of her presence or absence, all of these things become the template for the infant. And the body of that infant carries that template forward into every room that it enters for the rest of its life, every relationship that it has for the rest of its life. And so I'm saying it, but I mean, this means you, and this means your clients, right? And so the anxiously organized body does something really different. And then we're going to explore that. Right? So the approach amplifies with the anxiously organized body. The reaching becomes urgent or compressed as though contact has to be seized before it disappears. So you can see this in session. A client who moves to the edge of their seat, who leans forward a lot, whose eyes search, maybe searching your eyes with an intensity that might even feel like a hunger. And you can feel it in your own body, a pull, a slight overwhelm maybe. Maybe it feels good to you too, right? And there might be a reflexive desire to create distance or to move towards it, depending on your style, which if you're not tracking in your own response could have an impact on that individual, right? And you might act that out without knowing what happens. So there's something that I've observed many, many times in my work with clients, and that's when two people are in the room together. So let's say partners, for instance. So I'll give you a scenario, right? These two people come in, their chairs are maybe a certain distance apart, a distance that they selected they're not really thinking about it. It's just something that they did, right? And it tells me more about their relational dynamic than anything that they're going to say in the next hour or two that we're spending together. And this isn't exclusive to being in person. We can see this when we're working with people on Zoom. Yeah. One leans forward, the other leans back, or both orient towards me rather than toward each other, triangulating through me, the practitioner, because direct proximity might have become too, charged between them. Or they sit close, but their bodies are tense. They're not soft, right? The proximity is there, but the physical availability for connection and closeness isn't there in the same way. Yeah, so they're near each other without the nervous system, the body participating in that nearness. So we can shift one variable, just one, right? Let's say I ask one partner to move their chair 6 inches closer. Everything's going to change. Breathing changes, posture changes, and often the person that moves closer will feel a flush or warmth. We might label that as anxiety, but we might just label it as energy, right? And sometimes both of those things happen at once. There also could be ambivalence. It depends on the person, right? So in this example, they're feeling warmth. So the person who's approached will either soften or brace, and that response is rarely what they predict, unless they're incredibly self-aware. Right? So a client who describes herself as wanting more closeness will sometimes pull back when it's offered because their body's remembering something that maybe they don't have words for, that they're not quite aware of intellectually. Or maybe a client who describes himself as needing space will sometimes settle when the distance shrinks because the vigilance of monitoring a larger perimeter finally reduces and relaxes. There are a lot of other examples that we could give here, but this really gives you a taste or flavor of what proximity really helps us to see or reveal for our clients. Right? The gap between the narrative, the words they're using, and the body becomes really hard for us to ignore when we know what to look for. And there's finally awareness present with the pattern that's living underneath. Right? So what people say they want from closeness and what their body does with that closeness are really often very different. And the gap is the territory where attachment patterns live, right? So the patterns living in the lived bodily negotiation of distance and contact between two specific nervous systems in a specific room on a specific day, right? Two bodies negotiating this. Ruella Frank's contribution to this understanding has been really, really important for the field, I believe. Her work on developmental somatic psychotherapy traces how the fundamental movements of infancy, and she was influenced by Bainbridge Cohen's work too, yielding, pushing, reaching, grasping, pulling, all of them carry forward into adult relational life. And the way a person reaches for contact in their intimate relationship echoes the way that they learn to reach as an infant. Yeah, so the muscular organization is the same. The way they push back, set limits, create space, there are motor patterns that were either supported or interrupted in the first years of life. Now, something that Frank observed is really interesting. It's that Practitioners who work only with words might not notice this. She observed that the interruption of a developmental movement doesn't erase it. Yeah. So the movement will often persist in various different ways, and it gets encoded in the way the body organizes, right? So the body's just waiting for conditions that would allow it to complete itself. Dr. Levine discovered similar things with shock trauma. So when a client who's never been able to reach for help begins in session to extend their arm, something shifts in their body. Right? So the body responds to the movement. It's not something that can be accessed through words alone, right? We can talk around the thing, but when we engage the body, it's often really surprising to the individual. Right? The movement itself is the intervention, and the completion of the movement in the presence of a body that can receive it is where the repair often happens. Now, I'm simplifying something that's way more complicated here, but for the sake of this, just giving you a taste of this, right? That repair then can impact their life in subtle and not so subtle ways as it ripples outward into new possibilities of action and relational dynamics. And what I find really interesting is that the attachment literature has been circling around this without quite arriving at it, we could say, for years. Now, there's some literature that does arrive at it, but most of it is circling around it. And we now know that attachment is repaired in the body, right? So it's in the specific physical, sensory-rich exchange between two nervous systems and two bodies where this takes place. And the body discovers that a movement that it learned to suppress can now, in the space where we're practicing with this person, be completed. And that discovery changes the tissue, changes the way the body organizes, and it changes the nervous system's fundamental expectations about what closeness means, about what threat means, and what safety means. And, this asks you as a practitioner to have a very different awareness, both of yourself and of your clients. And to work like this, you've got to be able to tolerate proximity without managing it yourself, without interrupting it or overemphasizing it, right? So you got to be able to sit with your client's sense of urgency without matching it or defending against it. You need to be able to notice when your own body braces, when there's tightness, or when your breath shortens, right? Or when your posture stiffens. And I'm contracting in each of these examples that I'm using here, but and to use that information rather than being driven by it or governed by it. Right? This requires practice. Your body is not neutral in the room with your clients or on Zoom. Right? The question is whether you're present to its responses or whether your responses are running the session without your awareness. And this is why self-awareness is so vital to our work with our clients. Yeah. Every practitioner has their own proximity signature. Each and every person does. Right? So you have your own and your own history of what closeness meant, what it cost, what it promised, what it didn't deliver. And that history doesn't disappear when you sit in the practitioner chair. It doesn't disappear when you're working with somebody or when you're in a friendship. It becomes part of the instrument of your work, of your relationship. Yeah. So when you're working with clients, it's an instrument for you. And those of you who do the best work are the ones who know their own patterns intimately enough to track them in real time. And they can feel you can feel the pull and stay with it. You can hold proximity and distance simultaneously without losing your ground. Right? And this is what Schore describes when he talks about the therapist as a right brain regulatory partner. Right? It's the capacity to be affected by the client's state without being disorganized by it. Yeah. I want to feel what is going on. I want to be moved by someone, but I got to be open to that. Right? So the capacity to offer your body or your nervous system as a reference point for a different kind of closeness than the one the client has experienced in the past becomes a real support and an instrument for change. So this is an important capacity for you to develop as a practitioner. It develops through practice. Imagine that. Through your own therapy, through supervision, through training, through years of sitting with hundreds of different humans and learning to read the conversation that happens underneath the conversation. There's the thing that happens in the body. We want to be able to work with that. Yeah, it's something you build over a career, and it keeps refining itself as long as you keep paying attention. And I want to encourage you to keep refining this and keep learning. Yeah. The field has the research to support this orientation. So Hall's proxemics, Porges' polyvagal theory, Schore's right brain developmental model, Bainbridge Cohen and her work, Ogden's sensory-motor framework, Frank's developmental movement analysis. Each of these traditions that I'm naming here point towards the recognition that human beings are always, in every interaction, negotiating with the distance between themselves and others. And that the negotiation that's happening is the living expression of everything that the individual learned, that the body learned about what closeness is. And the implication for your work in all of this is really clear. You're already in this negotiation with every client who sits across from you. The only question is whether you're noticing it or you're working with it. If you find this interesting, you can follow the work over on Substack, or you can join us for one of our trainings. And if you're not ready to join us for a training, you can always jump into our collective, which is a membership where we practice somatics monthly. We meet 4 times a month for various different somatic practices. So we'd love to see you there. Check out the links below, and we hope you see you again.